Hey, Craig.
Hey Simon, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
Cool. What do you got for me today?
So today I'm going to be telling you about what racists, the women's suffrage movement, and the creation of the income tax have to do with the passing of Prohibition.
Okay.
So what do you know about Prohibition currently? Let's try to like
I
figure that out first.
well, yeah, so I it's weird that I didn't sort of think about it in these terms, but that like I guess just because I sort of like we all know that prohibition was like the outlawing of alcohol, but like the fact that it was a whole ass amendment is
Yeah.
weird, and it never occurred to me until now how weird that is because that's huge. It's not just like a law banning something. You got to
Yeah.
change the whole constitution, which is so much harder. It's so much
Yeah.
harder to do. And I guess it never really occurred to me, even having seen The Untouchables many times, right? Which is about all I know about prohibition. That how weird it is that it's a whole amendment. And I guess, yeah, it's just because you never stop to sort of think about it in those terms. So, but that's really about all I know. That and the hilarious pressed grape brick story from Prohibition. I don't know if you've
Oh,
ever heard that.
what's that?
So during Prohibition, there was this company that used to sell wine,
Yeah.
and they started selling these bricks of pressed dehydrated
Okay. Yeah.
grapes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And they came with a card that said, "Whatever you do,
Don't do this. Yeah. I was
yeah,
going to
don't."
include this. Yeah.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
I didn't know it was like considered a brick, but yeah, we'll
yeah,
talk a
yeah,
little bit about that. And then like, yeah, most today when you hear prohibition covered, it's like one through organized crime, like Al Capone and stuff like that. That's usually,
yeah,
the pop culture look at it.
yeah. The
Uh,
Untouchables, yeah,
yeah. And then also speakeasies. Like everybody has the experience of the speakeasy, and we kind of know that's like a leftover vestigial thing from prohibition, even
yeah.
if we don't know a lot about it. When do you think prohibition happened? Like when was it covered?
It was. I mean, it was the 20s, right? I mean, it's like it's synonymous with like the Roaring Twenties and the Great Gatsby, and yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And when do you think it was repealed?
like end of the 20s. I mean, I think it was just in time for everyone to get super depressed about the stock market crash, right?
Yeah, okay, you've got a rough idea, although there's
Okay.
you're missing some specifics in there.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there are any questions I should ask you to probe you anymore, but I guess not. I guess we'll just get started. I guess first thing like I want to talk about, and you've kind of alluded to this, is like it wasn't just some law that was passed. There was a law that was associated with it, because once the amendment was just very basic, just like allowing for the passage of law, and then there was a more detailed law that set out like very strict, a bunch of more specific restrictions around it after the amendment was passed. But just to pass an amendment, it has to pass two-thirds of both houses of Congress, so both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Then it has to be ratified by the legislatures of three-fourths of the states. So you think about like what our modern day Congress looks like and how difficult it is to pass anything, even on like a 51-49
Yeah.
vote. Like it basically, in order to pass an amendment, you need to get a super majority of the Congress, and then after that it has to go across every all the different states and make it through the state legislatures of all those, and only then will there be an amendment.
Yeah. So it requires like a level of agreement and unity that we're just probably not going to see again, at least in the near future, unless there's a dramatic shift in kind of political discourse.
Yeah, and it's pretty rare. We've only passed 27 amendments in the entire history of the United States. When do you think the last time we ratified an amendment was?
I should know this.
I didn't know this until like a year ago or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna say the the 50s, the 60s. I don't know.
No, there was actually an amendment ratified in 1992,
Oh,
and I think I didn't really look into this, but I just know this from memory. Is that like there was amendment passed years ago that Congress um, could not like pass a pay raise for itself if it did pass a pays raise for itself, they had to wait until the next session of Congress could be sworn in. So basically,
Okay.
in between whenever Congress raised its salary and when that salary kicked in, it needed to go to the polls basically to kick out whatever congressman you wanted before they could. So anybody who actually voted to
Mhm.
pass that was at risk of losing their job, basically. So it was like this amendment that didn't get that got passed but wasn't ratified by enough states. And I think like sometime in like the 80s or something, there was like this college student, maybe it was the 70s or 80s, this college student who did like a class presentation on how to get the 27th amendment passed, and his teacher gave him like a D. And her reasoning was like this would never actually happen. This is completely unrealistic. And so that one dude just made it his life mission to get this amendment passed, and he went state by state and got the final ratification for it and got it passed into an amendment.
All because his teacher just,
Gave him a
yeah,
D. Yeah.
that's
The la
hilarious.
Yeah, and then like the last one before that was 1971, and I think the last one before that was like 1965. And then so there was like the amendments to, bring the voting age from 21 to 18.
Mm,
There was the amendment after Roosevelt's death that set the presidential term limits at 2.
right.
And then there was one that just said it so that states directly uh elected their own senators. But overall it's incredibly difficult to pass an amendment. So
Right.
why, given how what this random ass thing like banning all of like alcohol, how did that happen? And there's actually a cluster of amendments that are all kind of related that like had to do with the 18th Amendment, the passage of Prohibition. The first three are the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment that turned the slaves into citizens, and the 15th Amendment that gave black men the right to vote. And
Mhm.
what did that all trigger in the South?
Well, I mean, there was Jim Crow laws
Yeah.
to disenfranchise people. There was, you have just this sort of like suite of, I guess, institutions in place that were designed to, maintain white supremacy in the South.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that had to do with the passage of prohibition for reasons we'll talk about. Then there was the 16th Amendment, which was the creation of an income tax.
Okay.
Any hint on why that was needed?
Uh, why it was I just assumed budgetary reasons.
I know, but what do you think that had to do with prohibition?
Oh gosh. Uh, I people have less money, so now they're drinking more because they're sad about it. So we got to do that something about that. I have no idea.
Okay.
I
Next thing, and then the 18th Amendment was passed in 2019, and then shortly after the 18th Amendment, there was the 19th Amendment. You know what the 19th Amendment was?
no.
Giving the amendment giving women the right to vote,
Okay.
the suffrage movement. So there were actually like there wasn't like one like pro-temperance anti-alcohol movement. There were a lot of movements that kind of came together, and
Mhm.
that's how we came together with all these like these huge these like super majorities that were needed to pass the amendment.
Mhm.
The first was the women's movement, basically the women's suffrage movement. Why did the women's suffrage movement care about prohibition? So basically, starting in the 1800s, there was this explosion in saloons. And it became like this like working class social thing in urban cities for every man after work to basically go to the saloon. It was like a very like machoist type of environment. No women were ever there. And like saloons even started giving away free food. Obviously, usually it was like very salty, which made the men thirstier and want to order more drinks. I think like, modern day happy hours are kind of like this, where you'll see like not only reduced prices for drink, but also food as well. So the hope is that like you eating a bunch of pretzels and chips will get you to
Yeah.
order more alcohol. And
Well, like how
it's
many saloons are we talking about? Like per capita? Like were there more saloons than there are like bars now? Or
I don't know about compared to bars now, but
Like you make it
certainly more than like any time in history before that. Like it
okay,
became like a social movement. And
okay.
you know, the giving away of the food, like it apparently became where the phrase "there's no such thing as free lunch." Uh I'm assuming you've heard that saying
Yeah,
before.
of course.
Yeah, that's where that came from, is that it wasn't a free lunch. They were actually goading you into buying more alcohol.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more saloons a little bit further down. But because like the all these men were going to work in the morning, and then they were like going to these saloons, and they were like and where there were no women, and then they were coming home like blindingly drunk, like it actually, like the women's movement started to kind of coalesce around opposing it. Like women thought alcohol was destructive to the home. It caused men to get fired through absenteeism from their jobs. They died younger because they had cirrhosis of the liver. And of course, a lot of them like came home drunk and beat their wives. So like if you look at like a lot of the the rising like pro-temperance movement or women's rights movement in the 1800s, a lot of it was rooted in stopping, these brutes, these men from,
Mm,
destroying their homestead as a result of drinking. And like these were like these women who were in this movement were incredibly, you know, enthusiastic about it. There were like women vigilantes who would go into saloons. There was one particular, her name escapes me, but in these dry counties, they would go into these saloons with hatchets, and they would start trying to break as many bottles as possible
yeah.
in order to like shut them down and like
Was it
shake.
Carrie Nation?
I don't know. I can't
I
remember.
think her name was Carrie Nation. I think there was somebody, yeah, who was like, yeah, like a hatchet wielding. I don't know where that came from in my brain, but yeah, you like awakened a twitching dormant memory. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the women's movement was a very powerful part of the pro-temperance, the prohibition movement. And then obviously since women wanted the white right to vote, and there was this
Mm,
rising women's suffrage movement, like it just got basically the two things got tied and intertwined together. So
mm,
as the women's suffrage movement came up, the pro-temperance movement came up with it.
okay.
So that's why it's not a coincidence that the 19th Amendment granting the women the right to vote came after the 18th Amendment, is because the coalitions that formed in order to pass prohibition were also forcing, basically creating political capital that was spent in terms of getting the 19th
Okay.
Amendment passed.
So was there anything that you saw about, because like I wonder like about like how much this like public health concern had to do with like the type of alcohol they were consuming? Because like in the UK, right, there's like the tradition of like the pub, like everyone goes to the pub on Sunday, you go to the pub after church, but like the beers, like the real ale in the UK are like very low alcohol content.
Yeah.
It's like 2-3%. So like were these saloons just basically like plying people with just like cheap whiskey, and it was just a much more severe like public health impact?
Yeah, it was huge. Like, so we're kind of spoiling things now, but let's just say that back then, like, you think like binge drinking is bad now. It was really bad back then. I think, let's see, in 1830, on average, Americans consumed 1.7 bottles of hard liquor per week, three times the amount consumed in 2010. So yes, it was definitely like it was basically the only kind of, social. Obviously we didn't have TV, we didn't have
Mhm.
film. Like it was like there was an entire like societal, social movement around that was built around drinking, and it like it really
So by
was
like
like
1.7 bottles, you mean like a big bottle of whiskey,
yeah, yeah,
like
like
a
hard alcohol, like or
holy
moonshine or
shit.
something like that. Yeah.
Okay,
And that was the
okay,
average. Obviously, there were probably
yeah.
lots of variants with that.
Hmm.
The one final point I want to make about the women's movement. So, like, we'll talk about the racist whites and stuff like that. But like in my research, I saw also that it's a misconception that black people were completely against prohibition. But a lot of black civil rights activists, because they were aligned for years with the women's suffrage movement, they also supported prohibition. So, like a lot of famous pro-temperance advocates were like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois,
Okay.
and Booker T. Washington. So there was a faction within the Civil Rights movement for Black people that was also very pro-prohibition, and then that seems to mostly have been because of an alignment with the women's suffrage movement.
So it sounds like there was a lot of, I guess, marriages of convenience here where people found like they had a lot of like their own individual goals, but they aligned functionally with being able to like with these other groups who were also trying to accomplish something. So they formed kind of just like a temporary show of arms together.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
basic. That's basically what we're where we're heading towards. So
Okay.
so we have the women's movement on the one hand, then we have like Christians. That's probably the least. If I had to quiz you on who do you think drove the prohibition before we started all this, I'm guessing you would have pointed to Christians as being the main culprit. Would that be
Uh
right?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. The least surprising. So it was like puritanical Christians. Prohibition was supported by the Methodists, the Northern Baptists, Southern Baptists, New School Presbyterians, Disciples of Christ, Quakers, Scandinavian Lutherans, and the Latter-day Saints.
Damn
Um,
Scandinavian Lutherans.
yeah. Which religious sect do you think was against prohibition? Like it was fine with people drinking alcohol.
Uh well, I mean Catholics because they have
Yes.
like communion wine.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know
Yeah.
how much that was the reason behind it, but for the most part, Catholics, a majority of Catholics, did oppose prohibition. It was the only
Hmm.
kind of Christian that was, on the other side of the ledger, basically. So then we have the racist, and I don't think we should undercount this as like a huge part of what drove a lot of the political capital for prohibition. So like in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was like a lot of immigrants flowing into the country, and they were particularly flowing into urban saloons. In fact, like basically political machines were basically run out of the saloons, and
Hmm.
a lot of those immigrant communities, they were in the saloons, and they were organized in the saloons, and so like a lot of voting activity was being
Okay.
driven through the saloons. So like the prohibition movement, a lot of like xenophobes and racists kind of like tied the saloons to the rise of the immigrant scourge.
Yeah.
um and then we'll talk a little bit about that more in like the political
Yeah,
campaigning
because like
part.
a saloon was a natural place for, let's say like I mean, you're from country A, you come in through Ellis Island, you're in New York, you move to where other people who speak your language do, you're in an ethnic neighborhood, the natural place to sort of congregate is the saloon. And if you can get them there, then you have a chance of having them as like a voting block, pretty much.
Yeah. And especially since the saloons, as I indicated earlier, were tied to the working class, and like
Yeah.
who was in the working class, like who were doing these factory jobs and stuff like
Hmm.
that during the Industrial Revolution, it was the immigrants. So they
Yeah.
so they were the ones who were flowing into these saloons for their free lunch. And then the other
Well,
thing, had to do with this widespread fear among racist white men that drunk black men would rape their daughters. And so a lot of, if you look at like the old prohibition propaganda, like the flyers and stuff, like a lot of it actually referenced this meme of the drunk black rapist, and and a lot of like, fears around crime, immigrant crime, black crime, and stuff like that was centered around like it coming out of these saloons, and like these drunk, inebriated people basically going out and like creating all this mayhem and stuff like that.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not surprising, but yeah.
Yeah. So you have all these coalitions that were coming together, but still, like if you looked at polling at the time of like, who would support a um a whole ass amendment to ban alcohol, it still would have like easily lost handily if it was just like polling, where everybody was coming up to the polls and voting yes or no. And yet they were able to create a kind of like coalition within all the relevant national and local politicians in order to pass it. So how did
That
they
was going
do?
to be my question because
Yeah.
you're talking about the sort of like explosive growth of saloons and working class people and going to saloons and then after work and everyone's drinking their tits off and they're drinking so much alcohol. Like, where the hell did the support come from? Like, so what you're saying is if this had been put to like a national vote, this would have lost easily. Like, there would
Yes,
have been
yes.
no hope.
Yes, there would have been no hope at all of passing this. So in order to talk about how they did that, think about today's modern gun rights lobby. Um,
Yeah.
so if you poll Americans today about whether they think there should be more restrictive gun legislation, gun control legislation, it wins handily every time, even when you poll specifically Republicans. Like something
Hmm.
like 60 to 80% of Republicans, for instance, support support, more restrictive gun laws, at least like universal background checks and stuff like that is. So why do we have a system now where there isn't like there's like, this party, the Republican Party, that is lockstep, not just in local legislatures where they have power, but at the national level to not only block any gun control legislation, but to actually like pass more legislation that makes it more open. And basically it's because they created basically the NRA. And they created a wedge issue. They turned it into a wedge issue for a lot of elections. In the early 20th century, the prohibition version of the NRA was called the Anti-Saloon League.
Okay.
So the Anti-Saloon League and other coalition partners turned prohibition into basically a wedge issue where if they could just tip lots of individual elections to the
Hmm.
pro-prohibition candidate, then they could get enough elected to actually pass real legislation. And you think about like primaries today, especially not just at the national level, but primaries for like super local races. Like on any of those, what, maybe 20% of the population actually turns out to vote for
Yeah.
those. So if you have a wedge issue and you have a coalition that can, support the candidate that supports your wedge issue, it could be, more than enough to tip one of those primaries in the right direction towards your candidate. Trying to think of what I was going to say next. So like with like guns, that's how it is. It's like how the NRA has its rating system, right?
Yeah, they've like a 1 to 5 bullet review for like how pro freedom a candidate is.
Yeah, so basically in the run up to every election, every single candidate is given a grade and then the NRA endorses a candidate. And if you're
Hmm.
in, a conservative leaning, rightward leaning count like voting district, basically, where only 20% of the people are showing up to vote, that NRA endorsement can make all the difference between
Yeah.
whether a candidate is elected in the primary and then goes on to win the general election. So that could be incredibly powerful. So like over the period of like decades, the anti-saloon league and the prohibition forces, the pro-temperance movement, they basically just were just incredibly well organized about going district by district, primary by primary, election by election, and endorsing candidates who were pro-temperance, and being just enough to push them over and win the election.
Okay, yeah.
So when the 65th Congress convened in 1917, this is the Congress that eventually voted for prohibition. The dries outnumbered the wets by 140 to 64 in the Democratic Party and 138 to 62 among Republicans. So this was across both parties that they were able to get super majorities.
Okay. And this is the result you said of how many years of like
I
constant
mean,
work?
the temperance movement started in like the mid 1800s. So this is like
Wow.
decades upon decades of work. It's kind of like you think about modern day, like what did it take to overturn Roe versus Wade? That was
Yeah,
just
that's what I
decades.
kept coming back to
Yeah.
in my brain was, yeah, so like, and similarly, when you have like national polling about banning abortion, right? It doesn't match up with sort of how vigorously you get a lot of Republican politicians like turning banning abortion into their rallying cry.
Yeah. Yeah, and so they just slowly won election after election, and then gerrymandered the fuck out of every
Yeah.
every state they took over, which then allowed them to change the election laws to make it easier for them, in future elections. And then every time they got the chance to slip in a new Supreme Court
Hmm.
justice, they did until they had the majority of Supreme Court justices that they need to eventually overturn
That's
Roe
insane.
versus Wade. Yeah.
So similar to that, then with prohibition, so like one thing about overturning Roe v. Wade is that even though, it doesn't have that national majority support, the people who are passionate about it are much more likely to vote. And
Yeah.
so as a candidate, it's useful to be in that party because there's this voting bloc that's more likely to come out. Did we see a similar thing with stocking Congress with these dry candidates?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, a single issue voter is easier to generate. It's easier to get single issue voters around something that is currently like out of grasp for them. So for when it was Roe
Yeah.
versus Wade, abortion was legal, so there were fewer single issue voters on the pro-abortion side because it was the status quo.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing in the same way that alcohol consumption was legal at the time, there were probably a lot of people who like loosely were against prohibition, but they weren't strong prohibition
Mhm.
voters because it was the status quo. So why are you going to get how are you going to get people riled up about keeping the status
Yeah,
quo?
they're certainly not going to be as organized.
Yeah,
So,
and that's probably pointing, and we'll get into talking about this, why they were ultimately able to repeal.
mhm.
Because it's think about how hard it is to pass prohibition. They also had to get enough of a movement to repeal it, right? Which was also really hard.
Yeah.
And then like one other final thing that helped them in their political strategy was actually World War One. So like the Americans with German ancestry were very anti-prohibition and very well organized, but World War One basically generated so much
Oh, right.
anti-German hate that it basically strengthened the prohibition argument and neutralized the German
Mhm.
influence on American politics.
You know
And then
who else likes alcohol? The Germans.
Yeah, yeah. And then also people kind of were able to use World War One or to rally around the idea of reallocating the grain to make alcohol for the war movement
Oh,
because we had to
yeah.
be able to feed our troops and everything like
Mhm.
that. So it gave them, a convenient talking point. So, in 1919, they passed prohibition and then it is ratified through all the states. And there were only two states that opted out of ratifying it. Just to throw it out there, what do you think the two states were?
Who did not?
Did not ratify prohibition.
Well, if it's Catholics,
Ooh, yeah,
where are the most Catholics? Massachusetts?
you're close.
Somewhere New England.
Yeah, Connecticut and
Uh,
Rhode Island.
okay, yeah.
Yeah, those were the only two states that did not ratify prohibition. But by that point, we had all the states we needed and it went through. And then after prohibition passed, they passed a law that kind of, like I said, like passed all the specific restrictions, some of which they found loopholes around, which we'll get into.
Mhm.
But first, I want to talk a little bit about the income tax.
Okay, yeah.
So the alcohol taxes, believe it or not, were actually one of the biggest contributions to both state and federal budgets. I saw some estimates that between 30 and 40% of the government's income came from the tax on alcohol. Does that kind of blow you
Really?
away? Yeah. Yeah, it was huge.
That's
And,
insane.
and
Okay.
if you think about alcohol, if you ban it, it's not something that we need to consume. So it's not like it's going to be replaced by something else that fills your time. Like if you ban bananas, then people just eat more apples or some other kind of
Mhm.
food. But if you ban alcohol, like it was all like alcohol is always like a luxury expense basically. So it causes people to spend money that they otherwise wouldn't. And then obviously the government was able to tax it. So in order for them to stop themselves from depleting basically the national coffers, they needed some other kind of tax, and that's when that helped them in terms of getting enough support behind the income tax. And I'm sure there are lots of other movements and a lot of other things that led up to the passage of the income tax in order for it to be an amendment, but it certainly helped that this like growing political force in favor of prohibition was behind it, that so that they could go ahead and ban alcohol and not see an immediate decline in revenues for the government.
Well, yeah, because
Uh,
you can't just cut out 30 or 40% of your revenue source and not have a viable replacement.
Yeah, and it's estimated that prohibition cost the federal government a total of $11 billion in lost tax, which obviously back then, when the government was much smaller,
Hmm.
was pretty huge. But because of the passage of the prohibition tax, they didn't, or because of the passage of the income tax, they didn't feel that immediately. They eventually did for reasons we'll talk about coming up, but at least initially, it wasn't like a major hit to the
Okay.
coffers. Okay, so we passed prohibition and for the most, so it did work to a certain extent. Like there were it we did see an immediate, obviously all the saloons were shut down, all the major alcohol manufacturers were shut down. There was a decline in alcohol consumption as a result, but for the entirety of prohibition a lot of people still drank. So why were they able to do that? The first part was that between the time that prohibition was passed and when it was actually, put into effect, was that people had an entire year to stockpile alcohol. And they
Or just build
definitely,
their shelters. Yeah. They're
yeah,
just their booze case. Yeah.
yeah, and so there was basically a run on all liquor stores. And then obviously the alcohol manufacturers, knowing that, this was their last chance to make a buck, they started ramping up production. And there was a huge influx in 1919 or so, in which like there was so much alcohol that was bought and stored. So that was a big part of it. There were also provisions within the law that was passed in the wake of the amendment, that there were provisions that allowed them to make their own wine and beer for personal use. And
And this is what
this is what you were referencing earlier, where like there
yeah.
were huge surges in grape juice. Apparently, grape juice, if you it will turn into wine after only like 60 days.
Yeah, something like that.
So people would just buy a lot of grapefruit fruit juice and let it sit.
Yeah, yeah, and specifically the story about like the brick of it was that like there was this company and they sold these like bricks of dehydrated grape stuff,
Yeah,
and it included a card that said whatever you do,
yeah,
don't mix this with water in a 5-gallon
yeah,
carboy with a gas release and leave it in the closet for 60 days, or else it'll turn into wine. Just wanted
yeah.
to warn you about that.
Yeah. There was a lot of grapefruit, grape juice
Yeah,
concentrate was sold during it. Another thing is like a lot of like medicines back then were basically just alcohol. So there was a huge surge of doctors who wrote prescriptions for medicines that were basically just, well, I'm going to put medicines in air quotes,
yeah,
that were basically just alcohol. Like if you look at the statistics about prescriptions around medication around that time, like it just jumped up in huge amounts. And obviously there was alcohol in a lot of things that like we use for like cleaning products and stuff like that. And there was a huge surge in purchases of those kinds of products, and then people would know how to like basically separate the alcohol from the whatever the substance was. And that caused the government to pass all these laws that basically forced all these chemical manufacturers to insert chemicals that were poisonous, so that people couldn't do this. And that resulted in a huge influx, like over 10,000 deaths as a result of them inserting poison into a lot of these household items that
yeah. I was
people
gonna
were
say,
using.
wouldn't that just like kill people?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm guessing like people eventually got educated by it, and stopped doing it, but that was like a that was a result of them trying to insert poison into a
yeah.
lot of these items. Another problem was that there was virtually no money set aside for enforcement. In fact, there was like no centralized authority dedicated to enforcing prohibition. And so, it was spread out across all these different federal agencies, all of which, were underfunded and did not want to allocate their budgets or enforcement towards prohibition, which wasn't even particularly popular.
Mhm.
And kind of like the modern day equivalent, and I'm sure this will come up a few other times, is like marijuana today. Like, how much time do like the feds, this is why all these states are able to pass, marijuana legalization, because for the most part, unless you're like really like causing a ruckus, like the feds just don't care that much about marijuana,
Yeah.
you know.
Were there okay, but so back to like the Catholics and sacramental wine, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
that was my
so
next point. So
okay,
there were a lot of loopholes. And
yeah,
so one of the loopholes was for church wine. And so all of a sudden, all these churches started generating like an amazing amount, gargantuan amounts
Everyone's just
of
suddenly
church
feeling
wine.
real Catholic,
Yeah,
just Catholic.
yeah. And then there was the rise of speakeasies, which I don't know a lot about, so I don't think I'm going to go too deep on it. But like, what there were all these interesting outcomes of speakeasies, like with saloons. Like I said, like women didn't go to saloons. Saloons were considered macho. But like
Hmm.
the rise of prohibition, like um uh eliminated that machoism with saloons, and so the rise of speakeasies, that was the first time that women started going to bars and drinking. And apparently, I don't know if this is apocryphal, the rise of, the reason that um bars today have like bar stools is because women needed somewhere to sit. Like before, I guess saloons were mainly like standing room only, and the introduction of like things to sit on was a result of women coming into the speakeasies.
Yeah, it used to just be like a brass rail, right? Like there was just a brass rail at the bar, and you would like put one foot on it, which is like where the term comes from, I guess.
And then also, we talked about this a little bit, but like it was kind of, the enforcement of prohibition was kind of like modern day drug enforcement, where most privileged rich people had no fear of enforcement.
Yeah.
And in fact, like most politicians who voted in favor of prohibition continued to drink.
Hmm.
It was just considered like this like toothless like amendment that the feds didn't really care about as long as you weren't the wrong kind of person.
Yeah.
And then finally, and I feel like this could be a whole other chapter, and like we said, it's been covered by pop culture a lot. Bootlegging became a huge industry, and we saw like the rise of Al Capone and all this organized crime that was all based on going into Mexico and Canada where alcohol was legal, and smuggling it across the border, and then spreading it all across the US.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think the border between the US and Canada is like the longest like unmilitarized border in the world.
Yeah,
Like its total length is like 4,000 miles. And then, I mean, so you've got that much open space, and it's a whole country that produces a lot of whiskey and beer. So it's
yeah,
not going to be too hard to go get some.
yeah. Okay, so Prohibition passes in like around 1920. It's humming along, and then it gets repealed in 1933. So why did it get repealed in 1933? I think like pretty much right away, as I've kind of hinted, it became quickly apparent to everyone that prohibition was really dumb and not really well enforced, and nobody was paying attention to it anyway. So
Hmm.
like almost immediately it became unpopular because like everybody continued to drink, everybody liked to drink, and it was dumb that it was illegal.
Yeah.
But the status quo would have stayed on, and speakeasies would have reigned, and people would have just made their own wine, except the Great Depression. So this kind of came into what you were talking about, the Roaring Twenties and everything like that. So obviously, what did we talk about? What replaced the tax revenues for
Oh shit,
the
the income
alcohol?
tax, but everyone was out of work.
Yeah, so the Great Depression happens, and suddenly the income tax just like completely plummets. And the government's like, "Oh shit, like we're not there's no income for us to tax. What are we going to do?" And then, at that point the government also realizes, "Hey, there's a lot of activity happening with alcohol where people are making a lot of money with alcohol,
Yeah.
and we're not getting to tax that because it's completely illegal."
Yeah, I mean, I at the height of the Great Depression, it was something like 40% unemployment or something like that.
Yep.
So yeah, okay.
And so what happens at first? There isn't a repeal right away. Prior to the repeal, Congress basically just starts passing laws that, because remember, there was the amendment that allowed for the passing of the laws, but then the law itself created all the restrictions for, how much alcohol, what the alcohol content for what could be served and stuff like that. And it was set super low. So Congress started passing laws allowing for the sale of like low alcohol content like beer. So all of a sudden you're finding beer is suddenly legal again in
Hmm.
most states. And they start seeing some tax reform out of that. And then it was formally repealed in 1933, opening a lot of, basically reigniting an industry and bringing in a lot of much needed tax revenue that FDR needed to fund the New Deal. But after it was repealed, a lot of states still had laws on the books um, uh, banning alcohol sales, and those a lot of those remained in effect for years and only slowly got repealed. And the last state to repeal prohibition was Mississippi in 1966.
1966?
Yeah, so Mississippi,
Really?
so up until then, there were still a few
Oh,
states that just like the entire state banned
okay.
Mississippi.
Huh,
Okay,
okay.
so flash forward to today. Do you, like we're almost like 100 years later
Yeah.
from when it was passed. What are the modern day effects of prohibition? The first is that people still drink less alcohol today than before prohibition. In 1830, on average, I cited this before, Americans consumed 1.7 bottles of hard liquor per week,
Yeah, it's
three
just bonkers.
three times the amount consumed in 2010. Now, I should acknowledge that in my reading on this, there's like this some discrepancy and disagreement over what the alcohol consumption rate was then and what it is now. Obviously, it's not easy to collect really good statistics about it now, and it was much harder to do it,
Hmm.
over 100 years ago. We still have the existence of speakeasies. They're kind of like these like weird anachronistic things that are just basically references to something that, is long past and no longer needed, but they still
Yeah.
do exist. And they're kind of like, a calling card for a certain kind of person who wants a certain kind of cocktail. And like, what are the attributes of a speakeasy? No signage, usually, no windows. They're quiet and dark, and that obviously was all the kind of attributes that you needed to avoid law enforcement, or at least get them to look
Yeah.
the other way. Um,
Didn't we go to something like that in DC once together?
I'm sure we did. Oh, so there's one place called the Gibson where you wouldn't have known it was there
Yeah.
unless you knew ahead of time that it was there. So
Yeah.
that might have been it. But there's still like in a lot of major cities
Hmm.
today, there are still speakeasies that are being launched today.
Yeah.
And like we just went to one in Baltimore not that long ago, that we went to several in Philadelphia. They're usually like in alleyways and stuff like that. And it's like it's funny because they're not really needed anymore, for obvious reasons, because bars are openly allowed to exist,
Yeah.
but they're trying to recreate this like aura of a 1920s era speakeasy, basically. And I remember like one time we went to a speakeasy we really liked in Philly, and we were all excited, and we got shushed to be quieter when going in, because like they wanted things to be like really quiet, mostly not to annoy the neighbors, but it was an interesting parallel to the reasons that speakeasies existed before.
Yeah.
I already talked about like how the bar stools were introduced to accommodate women. The popularities of speakeasies were associated with the rise of jazz music. So since
Mm,
it's where a lot of jazz bands played. So basically the entire modern day jazz genre has its roots in speakeasies and the popularity of it
yeah.
then.
So
Till
what
this
about like the long-term effects of, I mean, and you were talking about this sort of just the amount of money that people were making in bootlegging. So you get like organized crime syndicates with this huge injection of money that have also accumulated a ton of power. Like, to what extent do we owe, like, I mean, obviously, like, the mafia is not the same thing now that it used to be, but I mean, sort of like the growth and power of organized crime, how much of that can be attributed to prohibition and the fact that there was just millions of dollars to be made here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, and I feel like that's a whole rabbit hole that I could have gone down that would have like
Yeah.
taken hours in of itself. I guess I will note, were you a Sopranos fan?
I remember watching it. I wouldn't call myself a fan.
Yeah, so the whole idea of The Sopranos is that Tony Soprano is like a lot of his anxiety, because he goes to a therapist because he has like panic attacks and stuff like that, stems from the fact that his generation is on the decline when it comes to organized crime. That like
Mhm.
like organized crime was at its apogee, was at its height, in his father's era and maybe the era before that. And
Hmm.
he's basically on a waning influence for organized crime. So I guess that, why did organized crimes, was it on the decline at that point? By that point, obviously the FBI and the federal government
Yeah,
had taken it very seriously, but I'm sure the rise of prohibition and Al Capone and stuff like that, that probably started the movement, the upward movement of organized crime, which later
yeah.
peaked and came back down. So that's probably the only thing I can say about that.
Kids
Um,
today barely do a mafia.
yeah. So till this day, the 21st Amendment is the only amendment that was passed to meant to repeal a previous amendment.
Oh, okay.
So that's a cool fact.
Yeah.
And then obviously, I'm sure you know this, but there's still lots of dry counties in the South that are left over from
Hmm.
that Prohibition era, where when you're passing through them, you won't find a single bar or liquor store, at least one that's like operating out in the open.
And there's a lot more that are like dry sometimes. Like the county I grew up in Illinois, McDonough, at least at the time, was when I was growing up, was dry on Sundays.
Yeah, and the same thing in Pennsylvania. It was
Hmm.
I don't know if this is still true, but when I went to college in Pennsylvania, alcohol stores and beer stores were all closed on Sundays.
Yeah.
I think that got repealed, but I could be wrong. Um, Today, I think CNN did a poll within the last decade or so. 18% of Americans think drinking should be illegal today.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, so there is still a pro-temperance movement out there. Another cool fact, Alcoholics Anonymous was founded in 1935, two
Mhm.
years after repeal. So like some of the reading I said I read is that because like the government didn't acknowledge that alcoholics exists because it was supposed to be illegal, there wasn't really like a good like support, like societal support for alcoholics. So perhaps the rise of AA was some kind of some kind of outcome of the repeal happening, basically. And then, this is something I don't know a lot about, but like there are still tons of like post-prohibition era laws that make it hard for you to sell and access liquor today. Like if you, let's say you have like a favorite craft brewery or winery or something like that, like why isn't there a direct to consumer alcohol business like where you can just go on that website of that winery or brewery and just order those liquors to be just basically mailed to you, and it's because
Oh, right.
there are all kinds of laws that there have to be distributors, these middlemen
Yeah.
who are between you and the liquor store and stuff like that, are between the distillery and the liquor store. So there's like all kinds of complications around that. I'm sure there's tons of laws that are still left over from that era that are still enforced and benefit all sorts of middlemen and as a result.
Um, yeah, like the whole serving. Well, so yeah, like even counties that are the dry and Sunday counties, like if you're serving food, you're
Yeah.
allowed to serve alcohol. Or like what is it? Is it Salt Lake City where there's these like walls in between like the bar and where other people are, and then they have to like do like a weird handover of the wall or something like that to like technically circumvent this law, like preventing the public from encountering alcohol.
I don't know, but I know there are some places where I don't know if it's Utah or what, that where you can't pour liquor out of a bottle. It has to be these like little tiny like self-service bottles or
Oh,
single
really?
service
Like the
bottles.
airplane bottles?
Yeah,
That's funny.
basically. Yeah. And then I think like so Salt Lake City alcohol is legal in there because I've definitely been to bars there, but like there are definitely like large swaths of Utah where
Hmm.
alcohol is illegal.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's basically all I have. That's like the weird coalition that came together, the amendments that had to be passed, how it helped the women's suffrage movement, why we have an income tax today.
Yeah.
All of it draws back to the movement against prohibition.
And I think it's super interesting that yeah, like once it was passed and sort of, this coalition of people no longer had this kind of single issue to temporarily unite for because of this sort of sequence, like you said, of amendments, then it didn't have the same sort of like rah chopping up saloons support to maintain it. So it was, I mean, yeah, like 13 years is not a long time
Yeah.
to have prohibition. It was like that's really just kind of almost immediately, considering the fact that like uh Senate elections are every 4 years and congressional elections are every two and presidential elections are every four. Like
Yeah.
that's not a lot of time.
And going back to that thing about Roe versus Wade and how you can't form a coalition around the status quo.
Hmm.
Well, now that Roe versus Wade has been repealed, what happened 2022 is that we were expecting this huge red wave election. Why? Because typically in midterm election years, the party that's in the White House gets punished severely. You think
Hmm.
back to 2010, 2014, there were huge waves of Republicans winning, and yet that was an anomaly year. The Republicans picked up the least seats for a opposition party in like over 100 years. So like, why was that?
Yeah, they
And
don't they don't
it
have that single issue kind of block that's all passionate about repealing Roe v. Wade. So
not only
yeah,
do they not have a single issue block, but the Democrats now have a single issue block that
yeah, it's true.
is entirely geared around protecting abortion rights.
Hmm.
So that's kind of prohibition in a nutshell. Okay, that's all I have for you today.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Yeah. Like I said, it never occurred to me how nuts it was that prohibition was on actual the whole last constitutional amendment. I didn't even know how hard it was to pass one. Actually, I couldn't have told you all of those numbers that you told me about the
Yeah.
sort of the supermajorities and how many state legislatures need to pass it. And yeah, it's super bonkers when you think of it like that. And also just a really good example, I think, of how these ripple effects continue um onward. I mean, especially the big one there obviously being income tax, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I think like I was looking at like when I was doing research on that, it's clear that libertarians hate prohibition because they hate the income tax and they know how those two things are intertwined. So they're not, they're not huge fans of prohibition, basically.
I uh it's funny that you were mentioning the kind of this like huge growth of saloons because I live in Omaha now, as you know. Um and you've been here and it is not a rowdy city. It is a very Omaha. It's a great place to be 40, right?
Yeah.
There's not a happening nightlife here, but in the 1890s, apparently, Omaha was basically what you think of when you think of Deadwood. It was this. I read somewhere where someone had described it as like Sodom on the plains. There was
Wow.
this huge red light district downtown that was like 8 by 8 blocks, and it's just everything you think of when you think of the Wild West, like walking on the street, cowboys getting thrown through plate glass windows, gunfights, gambling, prostitution, a saloon every other building, right? It was
Yeah.
just this like den of vice, Omaha, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it was to the point where like in the early part of the 20th century, I think like the mayor was literally also the head of organized crime in Omaha, and everyone knew. And like, what are you going to do about it? Go have a drink, right? And
Yeah.
so yeah, it was. But when you think about it in terms of that as this sort of like people seeing these urban centers of yeah, like prostitution and gambling and violence and drunkenness and everyone drinking that much whiskey, you can definitely see how you could get the nexus of this sort of like moral panic, public health issue, things are getting worse, we need to stop it movement. But it's just wild too that it was like 80 years of work to
Yeah.
finally get it, and then it evaporated that quickly, which maybe gives me some hope that we can sooner rather than later reinstate abortion rights and reproductive rights and reproductive care, that hopefully now that sort of passionate single issue block now has nothing to scream about, that uh the rest of us can get to work and try to fix it.
Yeah, and also with like marijuana legalization, like I didn't look up the stats, but like they're like it was basically kind of like a growing snowball of states that have passed
Hmm.
various like loosening of restrictions on marijuana sales, both like
Yeah.
starting with medical marijuana, but then now just like complete lifting of prohibition across a lot of different states. And same thing with like gambling laws, like states are slowly loosening up those now that the Supreme Court has overturned
Yeah.
the federal restrictions on that. So there's all sorts of like parallels of other modern day movements for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's all I have for today. Do you have any
Thank you,
ideas?
Simon.
Do you have any ideas on what you want to talk about next week?
I do actually, and it entirely unintentionally relates to your topic in a way today.
Okay.
Um, but it is about okay, I'll just do you know what a third place is?
Third place finish? No.
No, third place is um it is any place that is not work or home
Okay.
that serves like a community building function. And
Okay.
so I was thinking about talking about third place and the suburbs, and it's a story that starts perhaps earlier than I thought it did. I'll learn more during my 3 hours of research next week before I talk to you. But it's that it moves through white flight and then into the creation of the suburbs, and then has caused these ripple effects that, we see still having sort of like being carried out in terms of online political radicalization and conspiracy theories. And yeah, it has to do with also kind of what you were talking about there. So that's going to be part of my 3 hours of research is figuring out if that factors into it or not. I have a feeling it does. I won't say any more because I don't want to give too much of it away, but I did want to ask you if you knew what third place was. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it vaguely rings a bell that this idea of another place, and I'm thinking of also the famous book Bowling Alone.
But
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But
Oh,
I'm not going to do any more reading about it, or
yeah.
that's what I vaguely know about it.
That's the book that touches on it. Yeah.
I realized that I forgot to do this in the beginning, but we need to make a habit of telling people what the name of this podcast is, Momentary Expert.
Yes, we do.
So if they were watching it on YouTube and they wanted
Mhm.
to listen to it on their podcast player of choice, they could do that. It's called Momentary Experts, and you keep on referencing this 3 hours of research. So kind of the premise of this podcast is that you can be sort of an expert on anything if you are given 3 hours to read on it. An expert to a layperson. Obviously, if we were sitting here with an actual historian who knew a lot about prohibition, I would sound pretty stupid. But to a layperson, I can sound sort of like an expert. So the
Yeah.
whole premise of this idea of what we're going with is that every week we're going to trade off, and the other person is going to pick a topic and do 3 hours of research and organize their thoughts and then present their findings to the other person.
Yeah. And it's a kind of a enacting of the world that we live in now where all of us have in our pockets access to pretty much the sum total of all information
Yeah.
immediately, right? So how many times a week does like your average more than average curious person sort of fall down a Wikipedia hole and fascinatedly read about something and then become a momentary expert? So yeah.
Probably more rare than you would think though, because like three
Really?
hour like a 3 hour block of time to just go and read about something
In one
random
sitting, but
versus
over the
some.
course of a week, I don't think so. I don't think it's that rare. Like just like I read about this thing, I saw a news article about it, and then yeah, in your like 20, 30 minutes sort of scrolling before you go to bed, you just end up like going back to the Wikipedia page. I don't really think 3 hours about a new obsessive topic is really that weird in the course of a week. It's just that we compress it into like one block.
But I feel like in my own consumption habits, like I'm either, if I'm consuming information, it's usually about something that'll help me in my job or is part of an interest that I already have. So it's like
Mm,
it's going deeper on something so I could get smarter about something already know well. Or it's like a pet issue of mine that I enjoy, or, all other kind of consumption is usually entertainment. So I'm passively consuming a story of some kind. I doubt, like in most cases, well, so I've always been a longtime reader of the New Yorker. And
mhm.
like what I like about the New Yorker is that you have like a 10,000 word article, about some subject that you would never thought of before in most cases. And like
Yeah.
you're kind of forced to sit there and learn a decent amount in the span of like an hour about that thing. So maybe that's why I was always drawn to that magazine and have been,
Mhm.
a loyal subscriber for over 15 years. So that's probably about the closest approximation. But I don't find myself spending 3 hours going down a rabbit hole on most subjects.
Yeah, see, it could just be that I get more easily distracted than you do and fall down like more Wikipedia holes. And I don't know, because if you're thinking about like 3 hours over the course of a week, that's like 20 minutes a day, right? Or something like that, of reading about a topic.
Yeah.
So if even like once a day for a week, you end up just sort of reading one thing about something for a total of 20 minutes, then you could hit that pretty quickly. But whether or not 3 hours actually happens is kind of like not the important thing. But yeah, it's just saying, yeah, like how much of an expert can we become in 3 hours, and then share with the other of us before it falls out of our heads.
Maybe that's why you became a librarian and I became a journalist. Like you have a more broad interest of wanting to learn about a lot of things, whereas a journalist, you're very beat specific and you want to drill
You are,
down
yeah.
and
And
get
you're
smarter
used
about.
to like hyper focusing on one thing.
Yeah,
And then like everything that you consume is going to be, if not that thing, like the other sort of topics that live in the same solar system.
yeah,
And I'm more just like a golden retriever seeing a truck full of tennis balls wreck. Just
yeah,
everything is interesting.
yeah. You're an autodidact. Okay, cool. Well, I know you have a pizza waiting for you that
I
you're
do.
waiting to hang up or heat up. Thanks, Craig. I hope we do this again soon, and I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to hearing your topic.
Yeah, man. I'll see you next week.
All right, see ya. Let me go ahead and stop this recording.